My name is Corbin Ainsley, and I haven't spoken to another human being in 203 days. I know this because I stopped counting on day 147, then started again on day 162, when I realized the silence had begun eating parts of me I couldn't name. The tally marks live on the back of the pantry door, 14 rows of 14, plus some change. Each scratch a small violence against wood. Each one proof that I still exist, even if no one alive knows it. The cabin sits at 7,000 feet on the eastern shoulder of Blackthorn Ridge in the Montana Cascades, 3 miles of unpaved switchback below me, dense lodgepole pine on all sides, a seasonal creek that runs strong through September, then thins to a whisper by November. I bought this place 6 years ago, back when I still had a career, a reputation, and a reason to care about both. The real estate agent called it a fixer-upper with character. What she meant was that someone had died here alone, and nobody found him for 8 months. I thought that was poetic. I thought I understood solitude. I didn't. The fortification happened in stages, not because I believed the world would end, but because work gave me nothing and the mountain gave me everything. After the incident, after Gallatin County Fire District terminated me based on an arson investigator's word against a rookie dispatcher's misread GPS log, I had nowhere to be and all the time in the world to be there. So I built, reinforced the porch with double-stacked railroad ties. Installed steel shutters I welded myself in the shed out back, dug a root cellar deep enough to stand in, ran 600 feet of water line from the creek through a hand-pump filtration system, cut and stacked 9 cords of firewood, enough for 2 winters if I burned conservative. I wasn't preparing for zombies. I was preparing for irrelevance. The outbreak reached the news on March 11th. I remember because I'd driven into Ridgeline, the nearest town, population 400, for diesel and canned goods. The woman at the gas station, Merle, had her phone propped against the register showing some news feed. Shaky footage from a hospital in Philadelphia. People in restraints. People whose restraints weren't holding. "Looks bad," she said. "Always does," I said. I bought 40 pounds of rice, 16 cans of propane, and a case of .308 ammunition. Not because I believed the footage. Because I'd learned that when the world gets loud, the mountain gets quieter, and I wanted enough supplies to stay up there until the noise stopped. The noise never stopped. It just went silent in a different way. By March 14th, Ridgeline's roads were clogged with people fleeing Missoula. By March 16th, the power grid flickered and died. By March 18th, I heard gunfire echoing from the valley, not hunting rifles, not the clean single cracks I'd known my whole career. Sustained bursts, panicked, then screaming that carried on wind for miles before it cut off like someone had pulled a plug. By March 20th, I welded the gate shut at the bottom of my access road and dragged 3 down pines across the switchback at the 1-mile mark. I disconnected my solar inverter from any exterior light source. I moved the truck into the tree line and covered it with a camel tarp I'd originally bought for elk hunting. On March 22nd, I saw my first infected. It came up the creek bed. A man in a torn postal uniform, his jaw hanging at an angle that meant the tendons had separated from the skull. He moved with that stuttering gait that looks almost like a limp until you realize there's no pain response governing it. No wince. No favoring of the damaged side. Just forward momentum driven by something that isn't thought. I watched him from the kitchen window for 3 hours. He walked into my perimeter fence, 8-foot welded wire I'd installed to keep elk out of my garden, and pressed against it without reaction. Pressed and pressed and pressed. Then, sometime around dusk, he turned and followed the creek back down. I didn't sleep that night, Not because I was afraid. Because I realized I didn't feel anything at all. The first 60 days were mechanical. I had systems. The systems worked. That was supposed to be enough. Every morning at dawn, check the perimeter fence, all 640 linear feet of it. Look for breach points, rust stress, fallen limbs that might provide a ramp. Every 3 days, hand pump water from the creek into the 200-gallon cistern in the root cellar. Every week, inventory the pantry, update the consumption ledger I kept in a composition notebook with a red cover. The ledger told me I had enough food for 14 months if I maintained 1,200 calories daily. Enough ammunition for more than I'd ever need if I stayed invisible. Enough firewood for 2 winters. Enough diesel to run the generator for 8 hours a week. Through December. The cabin itself became my entire geography. 700 square feet, kitchen, main room with the wood stove, 1 bedroom, a bathroom with a composting toilet I'd installed the previous summer. The porch, 6 feet deep, wrapped around 3 sides. The shed out back with the welding rig, the tool bench, the backup propane tanks. The root cellar beneath the kitchen, accessible through a hatch in the floor. I knew every creak in every floorboard, knew which window caught the morning light first, knew the exact pitch of wind that meant a storm was 12 hours out versus 6. What I didn't know was what happens to a human mind when every external stimulus disappears. Week 3, I stopped setting an alarm. There was nothing to wake for that couldn't wait. Week 5, I stopped changing clothes daily. The elk didn't care. The dead didn't care. I didn't care. Week 7, I caught myself standing at the kitchen window for what I thought was 20 minutes. When I checked the angle of the sun, 3 hours had passed. Week 9, I stopped cooking real meals. Why spend 40 minutes preparing something when a can of beans and a spoon accomplish the same caloric transfer? The act of cooking is social. It's preparation for sharing, for sitting across from someone, for the performance of normalcy. Without an audience, it felt absurd, like dressing up to sit in an empty theater. Week 12, I stopped using my name, not consciously. I just noticed one morning that I hadn't thought the word Corbin in days. Hadn't said it aloud in weeks. The word had become vestigial, like an appendix, a remnant of a system that no longer needed identification because there was only one node in the network. I marked the days, but the days meant nothing. Seasons shifted. Snow came in mid-April, late spring at altitude, and buried the perimeter fence to its top rail. I spent 3 days digging out the gate section, working in silence broken only by the scrape of the shovel and my own breathing. No music. I'd stopped playing music on day 31 because it made the silence afterward worse. The infected appeared periodically, never in groups larger than 2 or 3. Always following the creek bed, something about the sound of running water drew them, or perhaps the creek simply provided the path of least resistance through dense forest. I logged each sighting in the composition notebook. Date, time, number, direction of travel, behavior at the fence. They never breached it. The welded wire held. The steel posts held. My invisibility held. By day 60, I'd seen 19 infected individuals pass through my perimeter zone. Not one had reacted to the cabin. Not one had detected me. My theory, untested, unprovable but comforting, was that the combination of altitude, cold, distance from population centers, and my absolute discipline about light and sound made me functionally non-existent to them. I was a ghost haunting my own life. The troubling part wasn't the danger. The troubling part was the comfort. For the first time since Gallatin County handed me my termination papers, since investigator Harlan Brees sat across the table and told me I'd set the Clearwater Canyon fire that killed 2 of my own crew members, I felt no friction, no injustice, No need to explain myself to anyone. The world had ended and taken my accusers with it. Taken the evidence lockers and the personnel files and the newspaper articles that called me disgraced and under investigation, and relieved of duty pending review. The apocalypse had cleared my name by erasing the system that stained it. I should have been horrified by that thought. Instead, I felt something close to gratitude, and that warm, quiet satisfaction at the death of civilization was the first sign that I was losing something important. On day 104, I stopped talking to myself. I hadn't realized I was doing it until I wasn't. For the first 3 months, I'd maintained a running commentary, narrating my tasks, reading passages from the few books I'd brought, rehearsing arguments I'd never get to have with Harlan Breese. The sound of my own voice was a tether, a reminder that language still existed, that I was still a creature capable of communication. Then one morning I went to speak, to say something mundane, coffee's ready or cold today, and nothing came out. Not because my voice had failed, because the impulse to vocalize had simply evaporated. There was no one to hear. There was no reason to convert thought into sound. The translation step between thinking and speaking had always existed for the benefit of an audience, and the audience was gone. I tried forcing it. Read aloud from a water-stained copy of All the Pretty Horses I'd found in the bedroom closet. My voice sounded foreign, theatrical, like hearing a recording of yourself and not recognizing the person. After 10 minutes I stopped. It felt performative, desperate, like clap. Ping in an empty room. That was the week I also stopped looking in the small mirror above the bathroom sink. Not out of vanity's absence, though that was gone too, but because the face in the mirror had become unfamiliar. Not physically changed, not yet. But the eyes belonged to someone I couldn't reconcile with the man who'd once led a 20-person hotshot crew through a crown fire on the Bitterroot. That man had existed in relation to others. This one existed in relation to nothing. The seasonal creek slowed its flow as June dried the upper snowpack. I rationed the cistern more carefully, dropping from 2 gallons daily used to 1.5. The garden, lettuce, potatoes, carrots, a few optimistic tomato plants, needed water too. I'd built a small greenhouse frame from salvaged window panes, which extended the growing season but demanded irrigation. It was during one of these watering sessions, on day 112, that I noticed the boot print. Fresh, not mine. A size smaller than my 11 with a distinct tread pattern, horizontal chevrons that didn't match any of my 3 pairs. It was pressed into the mud beside the creek, just inside my perimeter fence, roughly 40 feet from where the water line entered through a gap in the wire mesh. I crouched there for a long time. The mud was still damp in the impression, less than 12 hours old. Someone had been inside my perimeter, someone alive, someone who walked with intention, with a stride pattern that spoke of directed movement rather than the arrhythmic shuffle of the infected. I checked the fence gap where the water line passed through. I'd secured it with a compression fitting and packed the surrounding space with gravel and hardware cloth. The hardware cloth had been pulled aside, replaced, but not in the exact configuration I'd left it. The gravel was disturbed. Someone had squeezed through, someone human-sized but thin. They'd entered my perimeter, walked to within 40 feet of my cabin, and left without me knowing. While I slept, while I sat in my silence, while I existed in my beautiful, complete, undisturbed solitude, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, my heartbeat in my throat. Not because a person had come, because a person had come and I hadn't noticed. My systems, my sacred, meticulous, disciplined systems had failed, or more accurately, I had failed them. I'd grown so comfortable in my invisibility that I'd stopped being vigilant. The checks had become ritual rather than reconnaissance. I walked the perimeter each morning, but I wasn't scanning anymore. I was sleepwalking through the choreography of survival while my mind drifted in the warm current of not caring. I spent the rest of that day reinforcing the waterline gap with welded rebar. I set 3 noise traps, tin cans with pebbles strung on fishing line, across the likely approach vectors from the creek bed. I loaded the .308 and placed it beside the front door rather than in the bedroom closet where it had lived for months, unfired, almost decorative. That night I sat in the dark on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders and the rifle across my knees, watching the tree line until my eyes burned. Nothing moved. Nothing came. But something had shifted. The seal was broken. 17 days after I found the boot print, she arrived. I say arrived because the word implies intention, and there was nothing accidental about it. She came up the switchback road, not the creek bed, not through the fence gap, walking in plain sight in the late afternoon light as though the world still operated on the principle that roads were for people and people were for roads. I watched her approach through the kitchen window for a full 8 minutes before she reached the porch. Thin, maybe 30, dark hair cut short and uneven, self-done recently. She wore an olive drab jacket too large for her, hiking boots with the left sole separating at the toe, and carried a single backpack that hung flat against her spine, nearly empty. She didn't knock. She stopped at the base of the porch steps, looked directly at the window where I stood, where I thought I was hidden behind the curtain, and said, "I know you're in there. I've been watching your chimney smoke for 11 days. My chimney smoke. Of course. I'd been burning the wood stove every morning for coffee, for warmth against the lingering mountain chill, and the smoke had been rising through the canopy like a signal flag I'd been too insular to recognize. Invisible to the dead, perhaps, but not to the living. I didn't open the door, not immediately. I stood with my hand on the rifle and my mind running calculations I hadn't needed in months. Threat assessment, resource implications, social debt. "I'm not infected," she said, "but I understand if you need to see that for yourself. I'll wait." Her voice was calm, not the desperate calm of someone performing composure, but the genuine flatness of someone who'd moved past urgency into something quieter, something resigned. I opened the door. "Stay on the porch," I said, and the words came out cracked and strange. My voice, a rusted mechanism forced back into service. She nodded, sat down on the top step with her back to me, facing the tree line, as though she understood that the gesture of vulnerability was more convincing than any protest of harmlessness. "My name is Darcy Lowell," she said without turning. "I was a veterinary technician in Ridgeline. I've been moving through these mountains for about 5 months. You're the first person I've met who isn't trying to recruit me, rob me, or use me." "You don't know that yet," I said. "No," she agreed. "But your chimney smoke has been steady for 11 days and you haven't moved toward town once. That tells me something about what you want." "What does it tell you?" "That you want to be left alone." She paused. "Which is why I'm not asking to stay. I'm asking for water. My filter broke 4 days ago and the creek below your property has a dead elk in it, probably contaminated. Water, not shelter, not protection, not community, just water." I filled a 2-liter bottle from the cistern and brought it to the porch, set it on the rail where she could reach it without either of us entering the other's space. She drank half of it in one continuous pull, then capped it and held it against her chest like something precious. "Thank you," she said, and then she stood, shouldered her nearly empty pack and walked back toward the switchback road. I watched her disappear into the tree line. Then I went inside, closed the door, locked it, and sat in the dark for 2 hours thinking about the sound of another human voice. It had sounded like a language I used to know. She came back 3 days later. Same approach, same visible, same deliberate. This time she asked for nothing. She sat on the porch step and said, "There are people in the valley organized under a man named Sutton Carmichael, ex-National Guard. He's consolidating every defensible position within a 30-mile radius, calling it the Blackthorn Compact. He's not asking permission. He's informing people of their participation." I stood behind the screen door and said nothing. "Your cabin is on his map," she said. "I know because I was in his camp for 3 weeks before I left. He has a cartographer, former Forest Service, who's been marking every structure with evidence of habitation. Chimney smoke, garden plots, cleared sightlines." She looked at me through the screen mesh. "You've been visible for months, Corbin. You just didn't know anyone was looking." The sound of my name, how did she know my name? The mailbox, at the bottom of the access road. I'd never removed it. AINSLEY stamped in reflective letters on the side, a ghost signature. She left again after delivering her warning, and I spent 2 days in a state I can only describe as furious recalculation. For 200 days I'd operated on a single premise, that my isolation was complete, voluntary, and permanent. That the world below had collapsed into something I could observe from distance without participation. That my cabin, my fortress, my monument to withdrawal, existed outside the new order because I'd opted out. But you can't opt out of geography. You can't opt out of being a point on someone's map. You can't fortify a position without making that position visible to anyone capable of reading terrain. I'd built a castle and imagined I was invisible. In truth, I'd built a target. The question wasn't whether Sutton Carmichael would come. The question was what I'd become by the time he did. I knew men like him, not personally but the type. The institutional man who, when the institution collapses, simply rebuilds it with himself at the center. Ex-military, ex-law enforcement, ex-fire service. Men trained in hierarchy who cannot function without it, so they manufacture it from whatever materials survive. Such men don't see a fortified cabin and think a person who wants to be alone. They see a resource, an asset, a node to be integrated into their network. And if you refuse the network, you become a threat, not because you've done anything aggressive, but because independence is a contagion to any system built on compliance. I spent those 2 days doing things I hadn't done in months. I walked the entire perimeter with tactical eyes rather than habitual ones. I cataloged my defensive weaknesses, the waterline gap, now reinforced but still a known entry, the north-facing slope where the tree line crept within 50 meters of the cabin, the shed with its flammable propane stores visible from the upper road. I checked the truck under its camo tarp, battery dead, predictably, but I had a spare that might hold enough charge for a single start. And I thought about Darcy Lowell. Her warning was either genuine or it was reconnaissance disguised as generosity. She told me Sutton Carmichael's name, his organizational structure, his cartographer's methodology. That was either the gift of a stranger who'd chosen conscience over safety, or it was the careful placement of information designed to provoke a specific reaction that someone was watching for. I couldn't tell, and the fact that I couldn't tell frightened me more than the information itself, because 6 years ago, before Gallatin County, before the termination, before the mountain, I could read people the way I read fire behavior. Subtle shifts in the social atmosphere that predicted where the flash point would occur. Now I'd spent so long in isolation that other humans had become alien, opaque, unreadable as weather patterns on a planet I'd never visited. On the 3rd day, I did something I hadn't done since March. I walked down the switchback road. Not all the way to the valley floor, just to the 1 mile mark where I dragged the downed pines across the road. They were still there, but someone had cut through one of them with a chainsaw. The cut was clean, recent. Sawdust still pale and unsettled in the track ruts. Someone had opened my road enough for a vehicle to pass. I stood there for a long time looking at that cut. The chainsaw implied fuel, organization, intent. It implied that Darcy's warning wasn't theater. On the walk back up, I found 3 more boot prints, different sizes, different treads. 3 people minimum had walked my access road since the last rain. I was being scouted, not invaded, not yet scouted, assessed, measured. When I reached the cabin, I sat on the porch and looked at the mountains and understood for the first time in 200 days that my isolation had never been real. It had been provisional, a gap in other people's attention that I'd mistaken for a condition of the universe. The universe doesn't grant solitude. Other people's indifference does. And indifference, unlike mountains, shifts. The next morning I woke before dawn and began dismantling the chimney damper system so I could install a spark arrestor that would reduce visible smoke output by 80%. I tarped the garden. I moved the propane tanks from the shed into the root cellar. I covered the truck with additional brush. I was preparing again, but this time what I was preparing for wasn't the dead. It was the living. Darcy came back on what I calculated was day 208. This time she was limping. A blood-soaked rag wrapped around her left calf, her face gray with pain and dehydration, her empty pack dragging from one shoulder. I didn't hesitate. I opened the door, crossed the porch, and caught her elbow before she fell on the bottom step. "What happened?" "Wire," she gasped. "Someone strung razor wire across the creek trail at knee height, tripline. I didn't see it in the dark." I brought her inside, set her in the kitchen chair, unwrapped the makeshift bandage and looked at the wound. Deep laceration 4 inches long, lateral across the gastrocnemius. Bleeding had slowed but hadn't stopped. The edges were ragged, not a clean cut but a tearing, which meant the wire had been barbed, not razor. An important distinction. Razor wire severs, barbed wire grabs and rips. "This needs stitches," I said. "Do you have a needle?" I had a suture kit in the first aid supplies, a veterinary kit, ironically, that I'd bought at the farm supply store in Ridgeland years ago for patching cuts. I might get working alone with power tools. I'd never used it on flesh, but I'd worked with precision instruments my whole career. You don't weld structural steel without steady hands. I cleaned the wound with boiled water and the last of my iodine solution. Stitched it, 8 sutures, imperfect but functional, while she gripped the chair arms and breathed through clenched teeth without making a sound. "The tripwire," I said as I tied off the last suture. "Carmichael's people." She nodded. "They're establishing a perimeter, not just your cabin, the entire eastern ridge. Anyone who moves through without authorization gets funneled toward their checkpoints. The wire isn't meant to kill, it's meant to slow and direct." "Toward what?" "A processing camp, that's what they call it, processing." She said the word like it tasted of something rotten. "They interview you, assess your skills, assign you a role and a location. If you have a defensible position, they offer you a choice: volunteer it to the compact or be relocated to a labor detail. And if you refuse both." She looked at me. "Nobody's refused both." I sat back on my heels, the bloody gauze in my hands, and felt the architecture of my solitude crumbling. Not from siege, not from the dead, from the fundamental human impulse to organize, to control, to make every free thing serve a purpose defined by someone else. "Why did you come back here?" I asked. "You could have kept moving, gone east over the pass." "The pass is closed. Avalanche debris from spring and nobody's clearing it. The only route out of this valley goes through Carmichael's territory. She paused. And because you gave me water when you didn't have to, that told me something about you too. I stood and washed my hands in the basin. The water ran pink. You can stay tonight, I said. One night, then we figure out what happens next. She slept on the floor beside the wood stove, wrapped in the spare blanket I'd been using as a curtain on the bedroom window. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark, the rifle across my knees, listening to the mountain sounds I'd memorized over 200 nights. But now there was a new sound, breathing that wasn't mine, the small shifting of another body in sleep, the creak of floorboards under weight that wasn't mine. I had forgotten how loud another person is, how much space a human occupies beyond their physical dimensions. The air itself felt different, denser, more occupied, vibrating with the low frequency of shared existence. I hated it, and I needed it, and I couldn't tell which feeling was more true. By morning, I'd made a decision that surprised me with its speed. Show me their perimeter, I said over coffee. Real coffee, the last of my pre-outbreak supply, offered because some part of me recognized that sharing was a muscle that atrophied without use. Darcy spread my topographic map across the kitchen table and traced lines with her fingertip. The Blackthorn Compact's territory formed a rough polygon across the valley floor and lower slopes, maybe 15 miles east to west, 8 miles north to south. My cabin sat just outside its northeastern boundary, high enough to be inconvenient but valuable enough to be noticed. Carmichael has roughly 80 people, she said. Maybe a third are former military or law enforcement. The rest are civilians who joined voluntarily, or who joined because the alternative was being outside the perimeter with no resources. How does he handle the infected? Patrols. 4-person teams rotating on 6-hour shifts. They've cleared most of the valley floor. The dead that remain are in the timber, moving through terrain too dense for efficient sweeps. She tapped the creek that ran below my property. This drainage is their biggest vulnerability. Infected follow the waterway down from the high country. Every few weeks, a group of 8 or 10 comes through. Carmichael's teams intercept them before they reach the settlement core. What about my ridge? Your ridge is what he calls a fire observation point. He wants someone up here with a radio, watching the northern approach and reporting movement. The cabin, the fortification, the sightlines. He doesn't want to take your home. He wants to deputize it. I sat with that word, deputize. Make legal and official a thing that was neither. Convert my withdrawal into service. My independence into duty. And if I say no, then you become a potential threat vector, an uncontrolled point on the perimeter that he can't predict. She met my eyes. He won't attack you. He doesn't have the resources for siege operations against entrenched positions, and he knows it. But he'll cut off your access to the creek. Divert it, dam it, contaminate it upstream. He'll make your self-sufficiency impossible without ever setting foot on your property. Water, always water. The fundamental leverage that no fortification can fully secure. I walked outside and stood at the porch railing, looking down through the trees at the valley I hadn't visited in over 6 months. Somewhere down there, 80 people were building something. Organizing, assigning roles, creating structure from chaos. Doing what humans do, what we've always done, which is make the world legible to ourselves by forcing it into patterns we can control. And here I stood, 7,000 feet above them, a man who'd spent 200 days perfecting the art of needing no one, a man who'd let his voice rust, who'd stopped using his name, who'd felt gratitude at civilization's collapse because it erased the record of his shame. What right did I have to refuse participation in whatever came next? What moral standing did a man have who'd watched the world burn from a comfortable chair and felt relieved? "There's a third option," Darcy said from behind me. She'd followed me out, coffee mug in hand, standing with her weight off her injured leg. "One Carmichael hasn't considered because no one's proposed it." "Which is?" "You don't join the compact. You don't resist the compact. You make yourself useful in a way that's yours, not his. Become something he needs but can't control. An ally, not a subordinate." What could I possibly offer that he can't take? She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Couldn't read because I'd forgotten how to read faces, forgotten the grammar of human expression, forgotten that a look could carry information as dense as words. "Fire," she said. "You're a wildland firefighter, and the pine beetle kill in these mountains means every slope is a fuel load waiting for ignition. The infected don't scare Carmichael. He's got guns and fences and patrols. But a crown fire through this valley would destroy everything he's built in a single afternoon. And fire season starts in 6 weeks." I looked at the trees. She was right. The lodgepole stands were full of red-needled deadfall, beetle-killed timber that hadn't been managed in years. The forest floor was a carpet of dry duff and fallen branches. One lightning strike, one careless campfire, one deliberate ignition, and the entire eastern ridge would go up in a column visible from space. I knew this. I'd known this the entire time I'd lived here. But knowing hadn't mattered when I was alone, when the fire would have been my own problem, my own end. Now it was leverage. The next 5 days were the most human I'd felt since March. Darcy stayed. I didn't ask her to, and she didn't ask permission. She simply remained, sleeping by the stove, helping with tasks, and slowly, without force, reintroducing me to the mechanics of coexistence. The negotiations were small but significant. When to use the bathroom, how to divide the labor of water hauling, whether to speak during meals or allow silence. I discovered I was terrible at all of it. Months of isolation had made me not just unsocial, but actively allergic to the compromises of shared space. Her coffee mug left on the counter irritated me out of proportion. The sound of her footsteps when I expected silence sent cortisol flooding through my system. I found myself tracking her movements through the cabin like a territorial animal monitoring an intruder. "You can tell me to leave," she said on the 3rd day, when my jaw had been clenched since breakfast. "It's not you," I said. "It's that there's anyone." She nodded as if this made perfect sense. Feral humans are just like feral cats. You have to sit very still for a very long time before they stop flinching. I almost smiled, almost. On day 4, she asked about the fire investigation. I don't know how she knew. Maybe she'd seen the old newspaper clippings I kept in a box under the bed, not for remembrance but for punishment. Or maybe something in my bearing announced it. The stiffness of a man who's been accused but never convicted, never cleared, left suspended in permanent ambiguity. "Clearwater Canyon fire," I said, the first time I'd spoken those words aloud in years. "July 6 years ago, 2 of my crew died, Patrick Eldon and Mick Saunders. I was crew boss. The official report said the fire jumped a containment line due to erratic wind behavior. But the arson investigator, Brees, found accelerant traces near my flank position. Said I'd set a backfire without authorization that merged with the main fire and cut off their escape route." "Did you?" "I set the backfire. Every crew boss on that mountain set backfires that day. It was standard practice in those conditions. Mine was authorized by radio, but the dispatcher's log had a gap. 20 minutes of recording malfunction right when my authorization would have been logged. Without that confirmation, it looked like I'd acted alone. and with Patrick and Mick dead, there was no one to verify what they'd heard on the radio. So you were not charged, not cleared, terminated with prejudice, investigated for 18 months, and then the case was filed as inconclusive, which in practice means guilty without the courtesy of a verdict. She was quiet for a while. Then, Carmichael's cartographer, the Forest Service one. His name is Briggs Oakton. He was Gallatin District before he transferred to Flathead. He might have been there during your investigation. I felt something cold settle in my chest, not because the name meant anything to me. It didn't. But because the world was smaller than I'd believed. The same people who'd built the system that destroyed me were building the next system, and I was still within their radius. It doesn't matter, I said. None of that matters now. It matters because Carmichael doesn't just want your position. He wants you. A certified wildland firefighter with structural protection experience. That's not a perimeter watch posting. That's a leadership role in his organization. And if he knows your history, he'll use it, the accusation, the ambiguity, he'll hold it as leverage. I understood immediately. A man under permanent suspicion is a man who can be controlled, who can be reminded at any moment that his credibility is conditional, that his participation is a gift from the collective rather than a right. I'd seen it before. Fire service politics. The way institutions keep damaged people close because their damage makes them pliable. So we don't let him frame the terms, Darcy said. We go to him first, on our terms, with something he needs and can't get without your expertise. A fire management plan. A fire management plan that only you can execute. That makes you SE. Entail but not subordinate. That puts you in a position where walking away costs him more than it costs you. I looked at her. This woman I'd known for less than a week, who'd appeared at my perimeter and cracked open the sealed container of my life with nothing more than a water request and a warning. Why do you care what happens to me? I asked. She considered the question with more seriousness than I expected. Because I spent 3 weeks in Carmichael's camp watching good people become functions, watching skills become obligations, watching freedom become something you trade for safety until you've given all of it away. She shifted her weight. And because you gave me water, and that's the only thing that's happened to me in 6 months that felt like it came from a person instead of a system. On day 215, we went down the mountain. Not all the way, just to the 2-mile mark on the switchback road where the forest opened into a saddle with clear sightlines in 3 directions. I'd chosen the location deliberately, visible, open, impossible to approach without being seen from above. A meeting ground, not a surrender. I'd sent the signal the day before. 3 sustained smoke columns from the porch, wet pine boughs on the fire pit, producing thick white plumes at 15-second intervals. The old Forest Service distress signal. If Carmichael had anyone with woodland knowledge, and Briggs Oakton certainly qualified, they'd recognize it as a communication request rather than an accident. By noon, 3 figures appeared on the road below us. They walked openly, weapons holstered but visible. 2 men and a woman. The lead man was tall, early 50s, with the erect posture and measured stride of lifetime military. Close-cropped gray hair. A face that had been handsome 20 years ago and was now merely authoritative. Sutton Carmichael stopped 30 feet from where I stood and studied me with unconcealed assessment. Ainsley, he said, not a question, he'd done his research. I was going to come visit you myself next week. You saved me the walk. I'm not joining your compact, I said. He smiled, the controlled smile of a negotiator who expected the opening position and had already prepared for it. I'm not here to recruit you. I'm here to inform you of realities. I know the realities. You're consolidating territory. My cabin's on your map. You want observation coverage of the Northern Creek drainage, and you've been cutting my access road. A flicker of something, annoyance, respect, crossed his face. You've been better informed than I assumed. I'm also a certified Type 1 wildland firefighter with 15 years of experience in structural protection. And the valley you're trying to hold is sitting inside a fuel load that could crown in any sustained wind event above 15 miles per hour. Your perimeter fences won't stop fire. Your patrol teams can't suppress fire. And your settlement, wherever you've put it, is in a drainage bottom that will channelize heat and ember transport like a bellows. Carmichael's smile faded, not into hostility, into the focused attention of a man hearing something he hadn't considered. Go on, he said. Your compound needs a fire management plan, fuel breaks, defensible space clearing, burn protocols for controlled reduction of ground fuels, early detection systems, evacuation routes that account for fire behavior, not just infected movement. Without these, you're building a fortress that the first dry lightning storm will turn into a crematorium. He was quiet for 7 seconds. I counted. And you're offering this. I'm offering expertise, not membership, not subordination. I come down when fire conditions warrant. I assess, I prescribe, I supervise. I go back up when the work is done. My cabin stays mine. My ridge stays unoccupied by anyone except me. Your patrols don't cross my perimeter, and the creek stays unmodified. That's a contractor arrangement, Carmichael said, not a citizen arrangement. Correct. The woman behind him, short, muscular, a holstered sidearm on each hip, stepped forward. Sutton, that's not how the compact. He raised a hand. She stopped. Tell me this, Ainsley. If I agree, if I give you your precious independence, what stops you from simply never coming down? What holds the contract? Self-interest, I said. If your settlement burns, I lose access to everything below the ridge. Medicine, ammunition, diesel, information. I need you to survive. You need me to prevent you from burning. Mutual dependency without hierarchy. His eyes moved to Darcy, who stood slightly behind me, weight on her good leg, face neutral. And her. She's not part of this negotiation. She left my camp without authorization, took information, shared it with an unaffiliated party, under compact law. You don't have law, I said. You have rules enforced by people with guns. Don't dress it up. The second man behind Carmichael, L. Younger, bearded hand resting on his rifle sling, shifted his weight. Tension hummed in the open space between us. Carmichael exhaled, looked at the mountains, looked at the trees, the red-needled dead timber standing like matches in a box all around us. I'll consider your proposal, he said. You'll have my answer in 3 days. He turned and walked back down the road. His people followed. I stood in the saddle with the wind pushing at my back, and my heart hammering, and my hands shaking in a way they hadn't shook since I'd stood before the review board 6 years ago. I was back in the world, and the world was exactly as I'd left it, full of men who believed that power was the natural state of things and freedom was a concession they granted. Carmichael's answer came not in 3 days but in 5, and it came not as a message but as an event. On day 220, I woke at 3 in the morning to an orange glow pulsing through the bedroom window. Not sunrise, wrong direction, wrong color, wrong hour. I was on my feet and at the porch railing in seconds, and what I saw made my blood go cold in a way the dead never had. Fire, running along the lower slope beneath my switchback road. A front roughly 300 meters wide, moving northeast with the prevailing nighttime drainage wind. Not a crown fire, not yet, but an active surface fire with torching and individual beetle-killed trees, sending columns of spark and ember 50 feet into the night air. Accidental or deliberate, I couldn't tell from distance. What I could tell was behavior. The fire was burning in dry grass and pine needle litter, consuming the ground fuels at a rate consistent with roughly 8% slope and 6 to 8 mile-per-hour winds. At that rate, it would reach my access road in approximately 4 hours, my perimeter fence in 6, the cabin in 7 or 8, depending on whether it transitioned to crown. Darcy. I was already moving, pulling on boots, grabbing the headlamp from its hook. Wake up, we have fire on the lower slope. She was alert instantly, the reflexes of someone who'd spent months sleeping in danger. How close? 6 hours to the perimeter if behavior holds, less if winds shift upslope at dawn, which they will. What do we do? It was such a simple question. What do we do? And the answer rose in me like muscle memory, like a language my body had never forgotten even while my mind spent 200 days pretending it didn't exist. We fight it. Not with hoses and retardant. Not with a 20-person crew and a helicopter dropping water. With what I had. A chainsaw, 2 Pulaskis, a shovel, and 15 years of knowledge about how fire moves through terrain. I opened the shed and pulled gear. Checked the chainsaw, fuel tank half full, chain sharp enough. The Pulaskis were where I'd left them, their edges honed out of habit even when I had no use for them. I grabbed both, handed one to Darcy. Can you swing this? I can learn fast. Good enough. We went down the slope in the dark, headlamps cutting narrow beams through smoke that was already filtering through the canopy. The goal wasn't suppression. 2 people cannot suppress a 300-meter fire front. The goal was deflection. Create a fuel break wide enough to deny the fire continuous fuel along its northeast vector. Force it to flank south, where a natural rock scree would starve it. I picked my line. A strip across the slope where the terrain flattened briefly, a natural bench, maybe 60 meters long and 3 meters wide. If I could clear that strip down to mineral soil, removing every twig, needle, branch, and duff layer, the surface fire would hit the break and lose momentum. The torching trees would still throw embers, but without continuous ground fuel on the other side, spot fires would be small and manageable. We worked for 4 hours straight. I ran the chainsaw, dropping every sapling and shrub in the strip, bucking limbs, clearing slash to the downhill side where it would become fuel behind the fire rather than fuel ahead of it. Darcy followed with the Pulaski, scraping duff and organic material down to bare earth, working with a ferocity that impressed me and a technique that was raw but effective. The fire reached our break at dawn. By then we'd cleared 40 of the 60 meters, not enough for textbook standards, but fire doesn't read textbooks. It reads terrain, fuel, weather. And what it read that morning was a break in continuity, a slope that transitioned from combustible to inert, a rising wind that lifted the convection column vertical rather than pushing it forward. The head of the fire hit our line and stalled. Flames licked at the mineral soil and found nothing. Torching trees on the fire side threw embers across the break. I counted 7 spot fires on our side during the next hour, but each one was small, isolated, and I stomped them out individually with my boots while they were still the size of dinner plates. By mid-morning, the fire had flanked south as I'd predicted. By noon, it reached the rock scree and diminished to smoldering patches that would burn themselves out within hours. I sat on the cleared break with my back against a stump, my hands raw and bleeding, my lungs full of smoke, my muscles trembling with exhaustion. Darcy sat beside me, covered in ash and dirt, her injured leg clearly painful but ignored. "Was that Carmichael?" she asked. I'd been thinking about it for hours. The fire's origin point was downslope, near the road Carmichael's people had cut open. The fire's timing, nighttime ignition during drainage wind, was consistent with deliberate behavior designed to push fire upslope toward my cabin. "Maybe," I said, "or maybe it was lightning, or a spark from his patrol camp, or an old campfire that crept." "You don't believe that?" "I believe that the origin doesn't change the behavior. Fire doesn't care why it started, only where it goes." "But the message, if it was a message, was clear. You think you can negotiate. You think expertise makes you untouchable. I can take your fortress without ever crossing your perimeter. I can erase you with a match." The fire changed everything. Not the way Carmichael might have intended, not by breaking me, not by driving me to compliance. It changed everything because it woke something in me that 200 days of solitude had nearly killed. Purpose. Not the false purpose of maintaining systems, checking fences, counting calories, marking days. Real purpose. The kind that exists only in relation to others. The kind that means you have a skill the world needs and you are using it. Fighting that fire, reading its behavior, predicting its path, placing the brake exactly where physics demanded, had felt like coming home. Not to the cabin, to myself. The man I'd been before Clearwater Canyon, before the accusation, before the retreat. The man who'd led crews into active fire because he understood it in his body, who could feel the shift in convection before the wind instruments registered it, who'd saved lives not through heroism but through competence applied at the right moment in the right place. I'd thought that man was dead, killed by institutional betrayal, but he wasn't dead. He was dormant, preserved in the amber of isolation, waiting for heat to wake him. 3 days after the fire, I walked down the mountain alone, all the way to the valley floor. Through Carmichael's cut road, past his log barricade checkpoint, unmanned when I passed, which told me something about his resources, and into the outskirts of what he was calling the settlement. It was more organized than I'd expected. A cluster of roughly 20 structures, some pre-existing homes, some improvised shelters, arranged around a central commons area that had once been a church parking lot. I saw vegetable gardens, rain catchment systems, a smithing operation repurposing scrap metal, dogs, children, laundry lines, the mundane architecture of human persistence. People stopped what they were doing as I walked through, not with hostility, with curiosity. A stranger was rare. A stranger who walked openly and alone was rarer. I found Carmichael in what had been the church itself, now converted to a meeting hall and administrative center. He was alone at a table covered in maps, a coffee mug at his elbow, reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked up when I entered and his expression was, I watched for it carefully, surprised. "Ainsley, I didn't expect a house call. You burned my slope." He removed his glasses, set them on the map. I did not. "Your people did." An untended warming fire at a patrol camp reignited in overnight winds. It was an accident. Your patrol camp was positioned upslope of my access road. Standard fire safety puts warming fires on mineral soil with cleared radius. Your people built it in needle duff beneath standing dead timber. Negligence perhaps, not intent. I let the lie sit between us. It didn't matter whether he admitted it. What mattered was what came next. "I stopped it," I said. "2 people with hand tools, 6 hours, and knowledge. I stopped a fire that would have threatened your northern perimeter within 24 hours if it had crowned and run downslope on the afternoon thermal reversal." He said nothing. Your settlement sits in a drainage bottom with dense fuel loading on 3 sides. The only direction that isn't a fire risk is the creek to your west, and that's where the infected approach from. You can't clear the fuel because you need the trees for concealment from the dead. You can't thin the understory because you don't have enough people with woodland skills to do it safely. What are you proposing? The same thing I proposed before, but now you know it's not theoretical. You saw the smoke. You know what almost happened. And you know I'm the only person within 30 miles who can prevent it from happening. NG again. He leaned back, studied me. I could see the calculation behind his eyes, the cost-benefit analysis that men like him run constantly. The question wasn't whether I was useful. The question was whether my usefulness justified my independence. The compact doesn't have contractors, he said. Then call me whatever you want. Consultant, advisor, fire warden. I don't care about the title, I care about the terms. He stood, walked to the window. Outside I could hear children shouting, some game in the commons area. The sound was so normal, so impossibly ordinary, that it made my chest ache. There's a woman, he said, who left our camp without authorization, who stole intelligence and shared it with an unaffiliated party. Darcy Lowell isn't stolen property. She's a person who left because she chose to. In the compact, choices have consequences. In the world, everything has consequences. But you're not going to pursue her, because if you do, my services become permanently unavailable. And the next fire, the one I don't stop, solves your consolidation problem by erasing what you're trying to consolidate. His jaw tightened. For a moment I thought I'd pushed too far, then he exhaled. 3 conditions, he said. Weekly radio check-in on frequency 16. Immediate response to fire emergencies within the compact territory, and quarterly fuel assessment reports for our planning committee. Done. And Ainsley, he turned from the window. If I find out you set that Clearwater Canyon fire, it changes things between us. I held his gaze. Investigate all you want. I didn't set it then, and I won't set anything now. Fire's not a weapon to me. It's a force I manage. There's a difference that men who have never faced it can't understand. He nodded once, and just like that I had a role that was mine, not given, not assigned, claimed. The weeks after the agreement were a strange education in re-entry. I returned to the cabin each night. That was non-negotiable. The mountain was still mine, still my sanctuary, still the place where I could close the door and exist without performing existence for anyone. But 3 days a week I walked down to the settlement and worked, assessing fuel loads, mapping evacuation routes, training a 6-person crew in basic fire line construction, how to dig to mineral soil, how to read smoke for wind direction, how to recognize the sounds a fire makes before it transitions from surface to crown. My crew was a motley assembly. Grover Tibbs, a retired cattle rancher with hands like saddle leather and a work ethic that shamed men half his age. Paulina Ostroff, a former high school track coach who could run a half-mile of fire line with a Pulaski faster than anyone I'd ever trained. Felix Marchetti, a 19-year-old who'd been a wilderness camp counselor before the outbreak and who absorbed instruction like dry soil absorbs rain. Adeline Cho and her brother Weston, both former tree service workers who knew chainsaws the way I knew fire behavior. And Darcy, who officially served as my liaison to the compact's leadership, but who, increasingly, served as the translator between who I was on the mountain and who I needed to be among people. "You're better than you think you are at this," she told me one evening as we walked back up the switchback after a long day of training. "At what?" "Leading, teaching, Being around people. I'm enduring it. You're enjoying it. You just don't want to admit that you need this because admitting it means the mountain isn't enough. She was right, and I hated that she was right, because if the mountain wasn't enough, if solitude wasn't the answer, then what had the last 200 days been? A waste, a delusion, a prolonged episode of a man hiding from his own species and calling it philosophy. Or maybe it had been necessary. Maybe the withdrawal was the fire break, the cleared strip between who I was, damaged, accused, retreating, and who I might become. You can't build on scorched ground. You have to let it lie fallow first. On day 251, the infected came in numbers. Not the 2s and 3s I'd been logging from my kitchen window. A column of 30 or more, moving down the creek drainage in the pre-dawn dark, drawn by something. The sound of the settlement, perhaps, carrying on night air up the valley. Carmichael's patrol spotted them first and raised the alarm by radio. I heard it on my frequency 16 scanner, already awake, already dressed. Insomnia was a permanent condition now, my body refusing to relinquish consciousness for more than 4 hours at a stretch. I went down, not because the infected threatened my position, they were heading away from my ridge toward the valley, but because my crew was down there, my people. The word surfaced unbidden and I didn't push it away. By the time I reached the settlement's northern perimeter, the patrol had engaged. Rifle fire in controlled bursts, Carmichael's people were disciplined, I'd give them that. But the column was wider than initial reports suggested. The infected were spreading through the timber on both flanks, moving around the defensive line rather than pushing through it. Ainsley, Carmichael, was at the barricade line, directing his people with hand signals. They're flanking east. I could see it. The infected were following terrain, moving along the path of least resistance, which was the gentle slope toward the creek rather than the steep pitch of the western hillside. It was the same behavior as fire, seeking available fuel along the most efficient vector. Pull your east team back to the church compound, I said. Let them funnel into the parking lot. It's open ground with no cover. They'll mass there, and you can deal with them in a concentrated group. That puts them inside our perimeter. Your perimeter is already breached on the east flank. You're not keeping them out, you're choosing where they concentrate. Open ground or scattered through timber. Pick. He picked. The east team fell back. The infected followed, 36 of them, I counted, emerged from the trees into the open parking lot over the next 20 minutes. In the clear, without cover, Carmichael's shooters handled them efficiently. 36 bodies on the concrete by sunrise. 36 people who'd once been something else. I helped with disposal, dragging bodies to the burn pit east of the settlement. It was the first time I'd touched the infected. The skin was cold and wrong, not just dead but degraded, the subcutaneous fat dissolved into something waxy that left residue on my gloves. I didn't look at faces. I couldn't. That night I walked back up the mountain and sat on the porch and watched the stars and thought about the word home, and how it was migrating against my will. Day 283. Fire season arrived with a vengeance. July brought temperatures 15 degrees above normal and humidity levels that dropped single-digit by afternoon. The beetle-killed timber I'd been warning about began shedding its last needles, creating a carpet of fine red fuel beneath every dead tree. Winds increased as the summer thermal pattern established itself, downslope and calm at night, upslope and gusting to 20 by midday. I implemented the burn plan I'd been designing for weeks. Controlled reduction of ground fuels in a 200-meter band around the settlement perimeter. Precision burning, strip ignition along prepared control lines, backing fire moving downhill against the drainage wind, consuming the needle litter and brush without generating enough heat to torch standing timber. My crew worked it with me. Grover on ignition, he handled the drip torch with the steady hand of a man who'd branded cattle in crosswinds. Paulina and Felix on the control line, tools ready for any slop-over. Weston and Adeline on the chainsaw, cutting safety zones for escape routes. Darcy on communications, relaying our position to Carmichael's people so no one got nervous about the smoke. We burned for 6 days. 10 acres of precision work that transformed the settlement's perimeter from a death trap into something defensible. Not fireproof. Nothing in a mountain forest is fireproof, but survivable. A landscape that could hold a low-intensity fire without transitioning to the kind of heat that consumes structures and people. On the 7th day, lightning struck the upper ridge. Not my ridge. The western ridge, 3 miles from the settlement on a slope of pure beetle kill. I saw the initial smoke column from my porch, a single white thread rising vertical in the morning calm. Within an hour it had broadened. By noon it was brown-gray. By mid-afternoon the column was pyrocumulus, a fire-generated thunderhead rising 20,000 feet, creating its own weather system, its own wind patterns, its own chaotic and unpredictable dynamics. I was at the settlement within 90 minutes of first smoke. Carmichael met me at the command post he'd established in the church. "How bad?" he asked. I looked at the smoke column, calculated rate of spread from the visible indicators, factored the afternoon wind forecast I'd estimated from the thermal patterns of the previous week. "You have until tomorrow morning," I said. "If winds hold pattern, upslope afternoon, drainage downslope at night, the fire will spread uphill today, stall on the ridge overnight, then push downslope toward the valley tomorrow on the morning thermal shift. It'll reach the creek drainage by noon." "Can we stop it?" "No, not with what we have. We can't stop the fire." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. 80 people, children, gardens, water systems, 6 months of rebuilding. "But we don't have to stop it," I said. "We prepared for this. The fuel break is in place. The defensible space is cleared. If the fire reaches the perimeter, it hits our burn scar and drops to the ground. Low in T. End city, manageable, survivable. If our burn holds, if no spot fires establish beyond the perimeter in unburned fuel, if the crew maintains suppression on any spots that cross, those are manageable ifs." He studied me. "You're asking me to trust that a 7-day prescribed burn by a 6-person crew will hold against a wildfire. I'm asking you to trust 15 years of my expertise. The same expertise you tried to conscript. The same expertise that stopped the slope fire from reaching your territory in April. And if it fails? Evacuation plan is already mapped. 3 routes south along the highway corridor, east through the saddle, west across the creek ford. Each one puts you in previously burned terrain within 2 miles. Previously burned terrain won't carry fire again for years." He nodded slowly. "What do you need?" "My crew, full-time until the threat passes. Radio contact every 30 minutes, and every able body you have ready for bucket relay ember patrol along the perimeter line." He gave me all of it, not because he trusted me, because he had no alternative. The fire ran the western ridge that afternoon, crowning through the beetle kill at a speed that would have been beautiful if it weren't terrifying. From the settlement, we could see individual trees torching, entire lodgepoles erupting from base to crown in seconds, their dead needles exploding into orange streamers that bent horizontal in the convection wind before dissipating into ember. We worked through the night. My crew walked the perimeter line in shifts, stomping spot fires, calling out ember showers, maintaining the line. I didn't sleep, didn't sit down, moved from sector to sector, reading the fire's behavior through the darkness, listening to it, feeling the radiant heat shift, watching the ember trajectories against the sky. At dawn, the fire crested the western ridge and began its predicted downslope run toward the creek drainage. The column flattened under the morning inversion layer, smoke pressing down against the valley floor like a lid. Visibility dropped to 50 meters. We worked blind, navigating by sound and heat. The main fire front reached our burn scar at 11:43 in the morning. I know because I was standing on the control line watching it come. It hit the cleared ground and died. Not instantly, fire doesn't work that way. But within 100 meters, the running crown fire lost its ground fuel connection. The individual tree torching stopped, and what reached the settlement side was smoke and radiant heat, and the occasional ember that my crew extinguished before it caught. The burn held. The aftermath smelled like the end of the world. Charred timber, ash mud, the mineral tang of superheated rock. The western ridge was black for 3 miles. The settlement was untouched. I stood on the perimeter line at sunset, watching the last smoke threads rise from the burn zone, and felt something I hadn't felt in so long I'd forgotten its name. Not pride. Not exactly, more like recognition. The landscape had confirmed what the institution had denied, that I understood fire, that my judgment was sound, that the decisions I made in the field were correct. Not because a review board certified them, not because a dispatcher's log confirmed them, because the evidence was there, visible, inarguable, the community standing whole behind a line I'd built. Darcy found me there as the light was failing. She stood beside me without speaking for a while, looking at the same burned ridge, breathing the same ash-heavy air. "Carmichael wants to talk to you," she said finally. "About what?" "He wants you to stay, full-time, in the settlement. He's offering a position, fire chief, essentially, a house, a role, full membership." I watched the last ember glow die on a distant snag. "What do you think?" I asked her. "I think you already know what you're going to say." I did, and it surprised me, because 6 months ago, 283 days ago, the answer would have been no without hesitation. The mountain, the silence, the perfect, complete, solitary machine of my survival, that was what I wanted, what I'd chosen, what I'd fortified and defended. But the mountain had taught me something I didn't expect. It taught me that solitude isn't peace, it's the absence of friction. And the absence of friction isn't the presence of anything. It's just nothing. A void that you fill with routine until the routine becomes your prison, and you call the prison your home because you've forgotten what freedom actually costs. Freedom costs engagement. It costs vulnerability. It costs letting other people's needs enter your calculations. It costs giving a damn whether the world beyond your perimeter survives. "I'll take the role," I told Carmichael that evening. "But I keep the cabin, I go up when I need to. No one follows me, that's my line." He agreed, more readily than I expected. Maybe the fire had taught him so. Ething too. That control is an illusion when the forces in play are larger than any single will. That the best you can do is understand them and position yourself accordingly. That people who do this voluntarily are more valuable than people who do it under compulsion. I moved most of my supplies down over the following week, kept the cabin stocked for retreat, a week's food, firewood, the basics, but my life center of gravity shifted downslope, into the settlement, into the noise and compromise and irritation and sustenance of other people. My crew became permanent. Grover and Paulina and Felix and the Cho siblings trained 3 more recruits. We built a fire cache in the old hardware store at the settlement's east edge, tools, hose, a hand pump system for structure protection. I drew up seasonal fire management plans on maps I spread across the church table where Carmichael did his governance work. Some days I went up the mountain and sat on the porch and listened to the silence and felt it pull at me. The old gravity of withdrawal, the seductive comfort of needing no one. But I always came back down, because I'd learned what the cabin couldn't teach me and the fire confirmed, that surviving isn't the same as living, and living requires witnesses. Not an audience, witnesses, people who see you, who know your name, who call it out when you've been silent too long. Darcy called it out most often, not with words, she wasn't the type, with presence. With the steady insistence of existing in my space until my space expanded to include her naturally, without negotiation or conscious decision. On day 300, I said my name aloud without prompting. Just sitting on the settlement's commons, drinking coffee, watching Felix argue with Weston about the proper sharpening angle for a Pulaski blade. "Corbin," I said, quiet to myself, but aloud. It sounded like someone I was beginning to remember. The cabin still stands at 7,000 feet on Blackthorn Ridge. The perimeter fence has a gate now, a real one hinged, that opens when I turn the latch. The chimney still sends smoke into the cold morning air on days I'm up there, and I've stopped caring who sees it. I think about the man who welded that gate shut in March, who covered his truck with brush and disconnected his lights and disappeared into the mountain like disappearing was the same as being safe. He thought he was building a fortress. He was building a coffin, one with excellent ventilation and a well-stocked pantry, but a coffin nonetheless, a sealed space for a single body to occupy until it forgot it was alive. 200 days of perfect isolation. 200 days of the systems working exactly as designed, and at the end of it I was less human than the infected stumbling through my creek bed. They at least moved toward something, toward sound, toward motion, toward the faint signatures of life. I moved toward nothing, maintained nothing, preserved nothing except my own continued breathing, which I'd confused with living. The fire taught me what the mountain couldn't. That safety is not the same as survival. That survival is not the same as purpose. That purpose cannot exist in a sealed container. It requires oxygen, fuel, and heat. It requires the friction of other minds, the obligation of other needs, the irreversible vulnerability of caring whether someone else makes it through the night. I am still here, 312 days after the world ended. Not because my fortifications held, though they did. Not because my systems worked, though they did. I am still here because someone collapsed at my perimeter, and I remembered that being human is not a solo act. It is a fire that requires tending, and you cannot tend a fire alone forever. My name is Corbin Ainslie. I am a wildland firefighter. I am still here.